I'm Jan Moulton, president of Plato, and I'm here to welcome you all here today. It's just fantastic to see such a warm, energetic crowd. I see a lot of familiar faces and some new ones too. So I'm wondering if you might humor me with a show of hands. I'm wondering how many people have been to a Plato colloquium in the last year? Would you raise your hand? Oh, you got a lot of return people. Okay, and how many people are here today for the first time to see a colloquium? Well, that's just terrific. Well, welcome to all of you. I've been looking forward to today's event ever since I heard that the topic would be the politics of rage. So I'm really excited to hear about our program today. Let's get on with it. I would like to introduce Richard Adler, who is the colloquium chair this year.
Thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first colloquium of the 2016-2017 season. We hope all of you will continue to attend these lectures that comprise our colloquium lecture series. In this heated election season, we are fortunate to have Professor Dan Schnur with us as our opening speaker. And by the way, this is his second appearance before Plato. I think he was first here in 2012. I'm proud to introduce him as among the most knowledgeable and distinguished men in the field of political education. Professor Schnur is the director of the Jesse M. Unruh Institute of Politics at the University of Southern California. The USC website states he works to motivate citizens and students to become involved in politics and government. Certainly a noble ambition. But if you take a good look at Professor Schnur's photograph on the USC website, which incidentally is the very same photograph we used on our poster that's outside today, you will see Professor Schnur is facing to his left with his eyes shifted to his right.
No one has ever.
Since my Plato discussion groups have trained me to look for deeper meanings, and by the way, my mentor is here today, and I tried to look for deeper meanings in this Mona Lisa type image up there, and I found that Professor Schnur had worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns, all Republican. He worked for John McCain and a media spokesman for Governor Pete Wilson for 5 years. This may explain his rightward gaze. In 2010, Professor Schnur was appointed as chairman of the California Fair Political Practices Commission, which commission is responsible for enforcing California's election laws. I thought, now we're getting somewhere. I think his grin comes from the fact that after he left this enforcement body in 2011, he re-registered as a no-party preference voter and launched a website called Fixing California. In 2014, he ran for Secretary of State as an independent. I think as an independent and as someone who understands all sides of political issues the way he does, this may help to explain why he faces to the left but looks to the right. It's at this point, when Professor Schnur becomes an independent, that I seriously begin to identify with him. You see, I have run several judicial elections for nonpartisan public office, the first time in 1980, and I was elected against an incumbent judge in a situation where, of course, a nonpartisan race, you couldn't get endorsements from any political party. Professor Schnur has many academic and scholastic achievements. I won't go into them all, but I think the greatest of these achievements and also proof that he knows what he's talking about, is the fact that he serves on the board or advisor to some of the most prestigious charitable foundations in the world. The William and Melinda Gates Foundation, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trust, and the James Irvine Foundation. You can catch Professor Schnur's TED Talk on YouTube. I know because I've watched it. And I learned that he teaches his students leadership qualities by quoting former President Lyndon Johnson. And the quote is, the second most important thing in any conversation is what I want. But as I mentioned in my Toga article, there are several things wrong with this LBJ quotation. And I will leave it to Professor Schnur if he wishes to address this, maybe in the Q&A or whatever he wants to do. About the Q&A, I know all my Plato colleagues here, you all have personal stories. I know this. Please don't do that. Don't mention them. Just stand up. You need to stand. No personal stories. Just ask a question. I know you're going to be sorely tempted. Don't do it. So without further ado, I give you Professor Schnur and the Politics of Rage, Trump, Sanders, and the Angry Voter.
That was phenomenal. Thank you very much. Wow. I have worked in politics and in academia for many years. I've had the good fortune to talk to many groups about the topics that I study. I have benefited from and suffered from any number of comparisons to statesmen, leaders, and others over the years, but Richard, no one has ever before compared me to the Mona Lisa. So there is a first time for everything. First of all, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank Adele and her team at Skirball. I think we all agree that the Skirball Center is one of Los Angeles' greatest treasures, and we're fortunate to have it and fortunate to be here. But I also want to thank Jan and Richard and all of you, because even though not quite as visible, I would argue that Plato is one of Los Angeles' greatest treasures as well. And the fact that so many of you come to these programs on such a regular basis, and I would say lift the quality of intellectual discussion and discourse in the greater Los Angeles area, is nothing short of heroic. And you deserve, frankly, a much bigger and better round of applause than you just gave yourselves. So let's try that again. Okay, we'll have to try it again later, I suppose. Richard, I want to thank you for that very, very kind introduction. It may not have sounded like all that much to many of you, but I just this week gave my students at USC their assignments for their final papers. And so, Richard, that is the nicest thing anyone has said about me in public all week long. So thank you very, very much. As you mentioned, and I think I'm wired so hopefully you can hear me, I get to serve as the director of the Jess Unruh Institute of Politics at the University of Southern California. And as Richard mentioned, what that means is my full-time job is to work with our students to get them more motivated and more excited to participate and become involved in politics and government and all forms of public and community service. And I will tell you, it is a great job. It's a phenomenal job. I've worked for 4 presidential campaigns and 3 campaigns for governors. You heard this is the best job I've ever had. In fact, I believe I have the 3rd best job at the University of Southern California, after that of our Max Nikias, our president, and Clay Felton, our football coach. For those of you who follow college football, you know that last week I had the 2nd best job at the University of Southern California. This week I'm back to 3rd. Saturday we play Stanford. Ask me again on Monday where I rank, but I'm hoping I stay 3rd. One other thing I'd like to just tell you, if you don't mind, about me before I get to the topic at hand, is Richard, and I appreciate it, mentioned my political journey. And I worked for many years in Republican politics, and several years back re-registered as a no-party preference voter. And what I will tell you is the same thing that I tell my students. I said, I have a very strong ideology, and I hope you do too. But my single biggest pet peeve in academia, whether it's at USC, whether it's at Berkeley, UCLA, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, you name it, my single biggest frustration with higher education are professors on the left or the right, who use the privilege they've been given to talk to your children and grandchildren as an excuse to inflict, and I choose that word specifically, inflict their own ideology upon those students. And I tell my students on the first day of class every semester, I say, I have enough respect for you at age 19, 20, 21. I have enough respect for you that I'm not here today, this semester to tell you what to think. You are smart enough and you have the capacity and the capability to make those decisions for yourself. So I'm going to offer you an analysis of the political landscape, but then it's on you, I tell my students, you decide what to do with it. Left or right, Democrat or Republican, green, libertarian, vegetarian, that's not my concern. But I'm not going to inflict my own ideology on you, and I come here today in the same spirit. Not to tell you what to think, because my guess, and I've been here before, so it's a pretty educated guess, my guess is that most of you, if not all of you, pay more than a passing amount of attention to the news of the day. And the last thing you need is someone who thinks so much of himself or herself to tell you what to think. That's not my job. What I try to do both in the classroom and in an environment like this one, again, is to offer you an overview. And so what I hope to do in this conversation, and I do want it in short order to become a conversation, is to offer not opinion, but rather an analysis of this political landscape. And to see if we can, for just an hour or so, have a conversation about the 2016 presidential election that is not about medical records and email servers, that is not about tax returns and even walls with Mexico. But what I'd like to do, if you're willing, is I'd like to take a step back and offer a broader perspective about how we got here. How did we manage to invent a political landscape that has produced a situation in which the two least popular presidential candidates in American history are running against each other for the most exalted office in the land? And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to undermine the title of my own talk. The politics of rage, the days of rage. My staff gets pretty creative on these kind of things. What I would suggest to you instead, because I know all of you, you read a lot, you hear a lot about the angry voter. I'm going to suggest something else to you. I'm going to suggest to you that the American voter, at least the American voters who have most animated this election, and I'm going to talk at least to begin with about the supporters of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, not because I don't think highly of Hillary Clinton, but because I do. But I think you would agree that the populist drives behind the Sanders and Trump candidacy have been the most noticeable aspects of this very unusual campaign. And so I would suggest to you that those voters, those extremely animated voters on both sides of the political spectrum, are not as much angry as they are frightened. And I want to talk a little bit, therefore, not about angry voters, but about frightened voters. And first, talk about why these people are frightened. Number two, talk about why they have reacted in this environment the way they have. And third, what that means for us as a frightened country when we face challenges that I would argue to you very, very strongly do not allow us the luxury of fear. So I'm going to start on the right. I'm going to start with Mr. Trump. And I'm going to start by talking about the core demographic group that from the very beginning was the energizing force behind his campaign. And I know all of you know this because I know you read and you think about these things very carefully. But so I think as most of you know, the demographic group that has been the fuel behind Donald Trump's campaign from the very beginning is a very specific demographic with which I have a great deal, although not everything, in common. Number one, these voters tend to be white. Number one, these voters tend to be male. Number three, these voters tend to be of a certain age. Where my demographics, and I suspect many of yours, although not all, may diverge from theirs, is I had the benefit, just like most of you did, I had the benefit of a college education. And the animating force behind Donald Trump's support base is a group of white, male, working-class voters who did not go to college. And I try to explain this to my students who, by definition, did decide to go to college. And it was expected of them. It wasn't even a matter of choice. It wasn't even a matter of conversation. Of course they were going to go to college, and they knew that from their earliest years. And once again, think of your own children, think of your own grandchildren, for whom it was never even a question. And think about how difficult it is to explain to them that that has not always been the case in American society. So what I ask my students is this. I said, what if somebody told you, when you were 15, 16, 17 years old, what if somebody told you you could achieve all your life's dreams without going to school after high school? You could become a doctor, you could become a lawyer, you could become a CEO, you could become a senator, you'd be whatever you wanted, and you didn't have to go to college. You were done with school. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? And they nod. And I said, well, I have to explain something to you. I said, for years and years and years, for decades upon decades, for generations upon generations, millions and millions of Americans were told that they did not have to go to college in order to achieve their life goals. They were told, accurately at the time, that if they chose not to go to college, they might not be wealthy, but they could live very comfortable middle-class lives and they could realize the American dream. And if instead of going to college, if they instead chose to work in a factory, on an assembly line, on a construction site, again, they might not get rich, but they could own their own home, maybe make enough money for vacations, for a summer cottage or an RV or a small boat. They could raise their children, and when they retired, they could live out their years in comfort and enjoy their children and their grandchildren, secure in the fact that there was a pension available to them to help them through the years after they stopped working. And I said, if that sounds like a pretty good deal, I said a lot of Americans agreed with that idea. Millions, tens of millions. And for year after year, for generation after generation, a lot of Americans, the bedrock of our society, they took that agreement. And they did everything they were supposed to do. They went to work every day. They played by the rules. They got involved in their communities, in their churches, in their synagogues. They coached their kids' little league teams and soccer teams. They did everything they were supposed to do to be fine, upstanding, reliable members of society. And then our country did a funny thing. We experienced the most wrenching economic and technological change since the Industrial Revolution. And all of a sudden, all these working class voters had the rules changed on them. Or at least they felt like they did. And they said, wait a minute, we did everything we were supposed to do. How come they're not living up to their end of the deal? Now, the they is a tricky pronoun, and we'll come back to that in just a minute or two. But they said, we did everything we were supposed to do. We followed the rules. And when they realized that the other side wasn't playing by those rules, for the most part, they didn't get mad, they got scared. And can you blame them? Because someone of my age, having worked for 30, 35 years, having raised a family, having kids or grandkids, and all of a sudden knowing that the job you've been doing for your entire adult life is no longer there. And you're not really ready to do anything else. You're not trained to do anything else. So let's think back in American history. When's the last time this happened? Well, the last time our economy shifted as dramatically as it has now from an industrial to technological economy was the Industrial Revolution, when we switched from an agrarian to an industrial model. So what did hardworking people do when that agrarian model changed? Well, they got up off the family farm and they moved to the cities. And many of them didn't like it. It was very difficult, very traumatic for many of them, but they knew what to do. Okay, this country doesn't need as many farms as it once did, so I'm going to move to the city and I'm going to start a new life. So that's the Industrial Revolution. What about now? What does that 55-year-old sheet worker do? Is he going to move to Silicon Valley? Is he going to move to Silicon Valley and acquire financing for a social networking startup? Probably not. And he knows that. And he's scared. And what our polling shows, one of the things I get to do at USC, and we can talk more about this later if you like, is I get to serve as the director of the USC Dornsife LA Times statewide and national opinion surveys. And one of the things we learned from that poll is that most Americans, not just these white working class voters I was talking about a moment ago, but most Americans have little to no confidence their elected leaders know what to do, given the transformations that are taking place in our society. Left or right, the commonality is our world is changing and the people we elect to office don't know what to do about it. And so if you are this white working class male voter who knows that the world you trained to live in isn't there anymore, you're frightened. You know that the political leaders in both major parties are not speaking to that fear and offering you solutions. And so when someone does speak to those fears and says, in my words, not his, I got your back, and when he says, in his words, not mine, I can make America great again, that doesn't sound threatening the way it does to so many other people. It sounds reassuring. And those fears, even temporarily, are a bit assuaged. Now, we'll come back to Mr. Trump in a moment, but let's talk for a little bit about Bernie Sanders and his supporters. Now, just as the Trump voters begin with that very specific demographic characteristic, so do the Sanders voters. And what's their shared demographic characteristic? They're young, the millennials. Or as I will now inform you, we are now onto the post-millennials. We call them the Snapchat generation, and that is a longer conversation for a little bit later as well. So let's think about the millennials, but let's think about them in the same context that we've been thinking about these white working class voters as well. Because while young people, as we all know, tend to show a bit more bravado on these kind of things, they're scared too. Because I've been teaching these young people for quite a few years now, and here's what I see. I see a generation, now onto a second generation of young people, who have been told since they are old enough to remember how special they are, how exceptional they are, how extraordinary they are, by parents, by teachers, by coaches, by mentors. Over and over and over again, they hear how special they are. Now, at some point in the past, this school of parenting emerged. After I grew up, I can tell you with some confidence. And I'm not pointing any fingers, because I've done it too. And I suspect many of you have as well. And so what we tell these special, exceptional young people is that we have certain expectations of them if they're going to live up to their specialness. And part of that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is going to college. And for those of you with kids or grandkids know, going to college, applying to college, is a much more complicated and much more arduous and a much longer process than it used to be. I can tell you with some confidence I did not spend a moment thinking about college until the middle of my junior year in high school. My dad may have started before that, but I didn't start until then. This is something that's hardwired into them from very early on. And just like these white working class voters who did everything they were supposed to do, so do these millennials. Think about what we've asked them. Get good grades, get good test scores, play a sport, play an instrument, be in a play, volunteer, go on foreign trips, rebuild your community, do a social networking startup, then you can apply to college and your essays will show all these things. So they've done all these things. And as I think you know, I'm exaggerating, but only slightly, because most of the millennials and post-millennials know that doing well in school isn't nearly enough to get into college. You do have to play a sport. You do have to play an instrument. You do have to volunteer in a community. You do have to do all these things because you're special. And then you get to college. And you get to college and you do everything you're supposed to do there. You get good grades, and you do internships, and you don't just join clubs, you start new ones. And then you graduate from college. And the first person in your entire life ever to tell you that you're not quite as special as everybody else told you you were is the man or woman to whom you applied for a job in the middle of the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. There was a study released last summer, I'm suspecting that most of you read about it, said for the first time in our history, more young people live at home with their parents than live with their partners. And I can tell you from not just academic research, but from very, very personal research, those young people are not all that happy about it. And we explained to them that their parents aren't all that thrilled about it either. But I would make the case to you that if you want to understand the Bernie Sanders phenomena, all you need to do is look at that one statistic. More young people live at home with their parents than live with their partners, not because they want to, but because they don't have a choice. Because they are either unemployed or they are underemployed or working in their jobs far less intellectually challenging and rewarding than a special young person deserves to have. And I know it sounds like I'm making fun of him, and I probably am, because I can do it because they're not sitting in front of me like usual. But I think what we have here is we have two very large demographic groups in this country whose fears propelled forward the two most impactful presidential campaigns on the political landscape in 2016. Donald Trump, of course, achieved the nomination of his Republican Party over 16 more conventionally qualified candidates. And for anyone who does not think that Bernie Sanders succeeded, I would remind you that 14 months ago, the idea of a septuagenarian socialist from Vermont with a 1.5% name recognition would push Hillary Clinton all the way to the end of the primary process. Not Joe Biden, not Elizabeth Warren, but Bernie Sanders. He might not have gotten the nomination, but succeeded in extraordinary ways as well. So now we've got this frightened country, and we have both candidates. The most unpopular presidential candidate in modern American history running against the second most unpopular presidential candidate in American history. And one of the things I learned very, very early on in my years working on campaigns, and I teach this in one of my classes at SC on political communications and strategy, is when you are trying to motivate your own supporters, not to persuade undecided voters, but when you're trying to motivate your own base, your own loyal supporters to turn out election day, there's two ways to do it. One is to tell them something very inspirational, something very aspirational, something very positive, something very uplifting about yourself and your experience and your history and your agenda and your goals. I would suggest to you that the most unpopular presidential candidate in American history and the second most unpopular candidate in American history aren't well positioned to do that. The other way to motivate your strongest supporters, if you can tell them something positive and uplifting and exciting about yourself, is to tell them something equally exciting, but much more terrifying about the opposition. And so what we have now is a country an already fearful country going into an election, being told on a daily basis how much more fearful they should be if the other person wins. And if you are like most voters and you make yourself available, whether you're inclined to agree or disagree is another question, but you make yourself available to the messages being delivered by both campaigns, what you're hearing every hour of every day is that both alternatives are absolutely terrifying. And when people who are already scared hear that, what happens? They get more scared. So in just a couple minutes, I know we're going to go to questions, but before we do, I want to talk just a little bit to wrap this part up. I want to move past the campaign to what happens after Election Day. Because to me, what's much more important than what happens on November 8th is what begins to happen or doesn't begin to happen on November 9th. What are the practical impacts of a frightened country and a frightened electorate? Well, what do frightened people do? What do frightened children do? What do frightened people of any age do? They run away. They run away from challenges. What else do? They look for other people to blame for their frustrations. And so a fearful person or a fearful electorate withdraws, either into your own self personally or into your own community, whether that's a demographic community or some other. And you become that much more wary and that much more suspicious of people who don't look like you or who don't think like you. So let's take this to the next level. Let's talk about our country's role in the world. How does a frightened country maintain its place on the world stage? And the answer is it becomes increasingly difficult. Because when countries get scared, they retreat from the world stage. And if you look back over the last century of American history, that's exactly what has happened after every major military conflict for the last 100 years, World Wars I and II, Korea, Vietnam, the first Gulf War, After every major military conflict, we withdraw. We come home. And it's completely understandable. We've sacrificed a tremendous amount of blood and treasure, the lives of extraordinary young people, and we don't want to do that anymore. We want to come home and we want to take care of ourselves for a while. After every major economic downturn for the last century, we tend to withdraw from the world stage as well, not because we don't care about the rest of the world, but because we need to take care of our own needs first. And what happens when people get scared is they run away. And when countries get scared, they run away too. And they become isolationist. And they try to hold the rest of the world at bay. Now, in modern political history, and by the way, I explain to my students, I say, if you want a definition of modern political history begins, I tell them, on the day that I was born. So just for the sake of this conversation, know that modern political history began on July 31st, 1963. And you can define that, set your own definition when you get the microphone. But in modern American history, the two parties have had very different ways of displaying this fear of these isolationist tendencies. When my old party gets scared and get frightened and get angry, this isolationism manifests itself on the issue of immigration. When the Democratic Party gets scared and wants to withdraw, those sentiments manifest themselves on the issue of trade. And I'd suggest to you, not taking sides in the campaign, at least not in this discussion, is I've come to believe that one of the reasons that Donald Trump has been so successful in his candidacy to date is because he is the first candidacy, no joke, of the modern era. He's the first candidate of the modern era, Republican or Democrat, to be so stringently opposed on both trade and immigration issues. And if you are a voter who's afraid of the rest of the world, that's a double wallop that you don't normally hear from more conventional political candidates. Now the challenge, is that leaders who know better succumb to these sentiments also. I don't believe that Hillary Clinton is against the Trans-Pacific Partnership any more than I believe that Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush is against comprehensive immigration reform. But both sides felt, because of the physics of their respective political primaries, that they had to say that they were. Now the good news is, if you look at history, American presidents tend to be much more responsible on these types of issues than American presidential candidates. Barack Obama in 2008, Senator Obama spoke very virulently against the North American Free Trade Agreement and expanded trade with Central and South America. And he, of course, has become the strongest proponent of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the largest expansion of free trade in our nation's history. Go back before that, George W. Bush, I do not believe, uttered the words undocumented and immigrant in consecutive order more than once or twice in either his 2000 or 2004 presidential campaigns, but began his second term, albeit unsuccessfully, by putting his political capital behind a comprehensive immigration reform package that included a pathway to citizenship. So both Obama and Bush, our last two presidents, when they got to office, realized that you can't run away from the rest of the world, you can't hide from the rest of the world. But my biggest concern is that when our next president takes office and when our next Congress takes office in January, the political trade winds are blowing so strong that it's going to be much more difficult for our next political leaders to withstand those isolationist tendencies because they are so strong and powerful in American politics. So what do you do about that? What do you do about a frightened country that wants to run away from the rest of the world? Well, I'll tell you what I do. I teach students every single day. That leaders don't run away from danger, they walk toward it. And before leaders walk toward challenges, they marshal the people in their communities and their neighborhoods who are frightened and explain to them that if you walk toward those challenges together, you can overcome them. But in the meantime, the best way you overcome those fears is for people who know better, for people who understand that when the United States withdraws from its obligations in the rest of the world, economically, diplomatically, and yes, unfortunately, sometimes militarily, that we leave a vacuum. And that vacuum is too often filled by those with much worse intentions than ours. And if we live in a society in which most Americans do not trust their political leaders, or business leaders, or labor leaders, or media, who do people trust? They trust each other. They trust their friends. They trust their neighbors. They trust their work colleagues. They trust the people with whom they have joined organizations like this one. They trust you. And so I think if we are, as a country, going to assert ourselves, and reasonable people can disagree on how reasserting ourselves can best be done, but if we are going to arrest these isolationist tendencies, if we are going to stop running away from the rest of the world, a president or a speaker of the House of Representatives or a Senate president isn't going to be the one who does it. It's going to be people's friends and neighbors and work colleagues, people who they know and trust and respect, who have conversations with them like the kinds you have at Plato, to help them understand that Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, there are certain obligations that a people take on, a certain set of responsibilities that we have that we can't run from, but that we need to walk toward together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Schnur. We're now going to get to the Q&A period. Remember, you need to stand, and you'll get the microphone, and just questions only.
Stand.
Over here.
Hi, how do you see the role of the press in this situation?
How do I see the role of the press in this situation? If I can ask one favor before we go on to the next, do you mind telling me who you are?
Marjorie.
Marjorie, okay, thank you. So Marjorie, great question. What is the role of the press in this? The challenge here, of course, as all of you know, is that the news media is a fundamentally different entity than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And the question I get asked more than any other, not just by my students, but by their parents and by others in the community, is where is that news source that I can go to? Where's that news source I can go to for reliable and even-handed and valuable and respectable information? Where is that magic oracle, they ask me. My words, not theirs. Where I can get all truth on all things. And of course, it doesn't exist, and of course, as all of you know, it never did. The difference is that when we were coming up, the decisions on what was news and what was not news were made by 3 anchor men in New York City and the editors of the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and the Wall Street Journal. So that responsibility for deciding what's news has shifted. And I am answering your question, believe it or not, but what I'm not doing is blaming the press, because I believe that they are responding to the market demands of our society. But the responsibility has shifted from those 3 anchor men and those editors and publishers to every single one of us. And so the answer, of course, is there is no magic oracle. There's not one source you can go for all the reliable information. But I think what the most informed and most engaged and most impressive members of our community do is they make themselves available to a wide range of sources of news and information and opinion. It's human nature to want to talk to and listen to and read the smartest people in the world. Who are the smartest people in the world? The people who agree with me. And if you find them on Fox and if you find them on Comedy Central, well, you're both succumbing to human nature. The challenge, and there are profound challenges ahead for the news media, and we can come back to that if you like, but I'd say even before we talk about the challenges of a broken news media model, I think ultimately the answer comes not from newspapers or television stations or online publications. It comes from those of us who are willing to break out of the ideological cul-de-sac in which we place ourselves. Nick Kristof, the fine New York Times columnist, refers to this phenomena. He calls it the me network. The me network, I love that. And what he means is you can put together an information environment that never challenges you, that never disagrees with you, that only reinforces and congratulates you for believing what you believe. The last assignment I give my students every semester in all of my classes, so I tell them, I said, okay guys, you've written your papers, you've taken your tests, so I got one more assignment for you, and you know what, I can't even grade it, but it's the most important assignment I'm going to give you all semester long. From this point forward, I want every principled conservative in this classroom to watch Rachel Maddow once a week. And I want every principled progressive in this room to read George Will or David Brooks once a week too. Not because I'm trying to change your mind, and not even because I'm trying to open it, but I'm trying to remind you that the people who disagree with you, most of them, aren't stupid or evil. They're reasonably intelligent people who've just come to a different conclusion than the one that you've reached. And while you can find stupid or evil people who you disagree with, using them as an excuse not to listen to the others is not a particularly valuable excuse going forward. So I didn't mean to skip your question. Before we can fix the news media, we, in this new media era, have to be willing to push ourselves beyond our natural and our comfortable boundaries.
All right, let's have a question from over here.
Hi, my name is Saul. I have a question. Both Sanders and Trump have an underlying premise that the elections are rigged. And particularly going into the presidential campaign with your frightened public, if Trump loses with this underlying theme that he was cheated, what do you think the reaction would be?
It's a great question. And you're absolutely correct on this. Both Sanders and Trump, using slightly different language, suggested that the system is, to use one of their words, rigged, and that the election's not going to turn out the way that it deserves to. Well, of course, all they're doing is they're playing to people's fears, and they're fanning the flames of those fears. They're saying, you're scared now. Well, if the majority of good Americans vote for me, and we still lose, then you really got something to be fearful about. I think it's tremendously irresponsible, and I am greatly concerned that after the election, I know a certain number of people will believe that. My hope is that not a large number do. I think at a certain point, you have to have faith in the system if you're going to live in a society with other people. Yeah. Jefferson said, if all men were angels, there'd be no need for government. Do I think the referee at on Saturday's football game is going to be perfect? Of course he's not. But I've got to be willing to have faith in his decisions, otherwise we can't have a contest. And so I do worry greatly that the losing side, whichever side ends up losing, is going to come to believe, primarily because they live in that ideological and media cul-de-sac where they don't spend time with anyone with whom they disagree. If everybody I know supports me, then how could we possibly lose, right? And my concern is that after it's over, they think that they were cheated, and that creates an alienated sector of the electorate that creates a very difficult challenge for the next president.
Michelle Dennis, should the economy be incapable of creating sufficient jobs over the next generation or two that meets the expectations of all segments of society, what could be the impact on politics, our model of politics?
So what is the impact on society if the economy cannot create sufficient jobs and economic growth for that society?
Jobs that meet the expectations of all levels of the economy.
Okay. I have to tell you, I'm not an economist. Yeah, I'm a politico, but I don't accept the premise of that question. You hear this line of thought quite a bit. What if the economic growth that we enjoyed through the second half of the 20th century was an aberration, and we're never going to have that again? I don't believe that. And this goes back to the conversation we were having earlier about a global society. If I'd say the opportunities for further economic growth expand dramatically, geometrically, when you facilitate the trading of those goods between countries. The opportunities for economic growth expand extraordinarily when the most optimistic and hardworking people are encouraged to come to a place where there is work available to them instead of turned away. Those economic opportunities develop to an extraordinary degree when countries find a way to cooperate diplomatically. And so to me, in order to avoid having to answer your question, you have to avoid the, no metaphor intended, wall-building tendencies that are driving the populist sentiments from the extremes of both parties. There are other countries in the world, certainly, that have had to dramatically adjust their expectations in terms of standards of living. But the economists who I read and who I believe in most strongly, I've come to believe that a country that does engage with the rest of the world, that educates its populace, and that's a longer conversation to be had, that educates its populace so they can fill these jobs of the new economy, and invest those earnings in the kind of growth and construction and infrastructure opportunities that employ people who might not be doing the social networking startups. The opportunities are there as long as we give them the tools. And just the fact that we're not providing the tools for those workers right now doesn't mean that they don't exist, doesn't mean that they can't provide it. It means that we need to be able to do a better job of preparing that next generation of workers to do the jobs that are there for them.
My name is Jerry Schnur, a little bit older than you. We just had an experience with one very bad moderator in a pseudo debate. What advice, what should the role be of the moderators in these upcoming debates so that we can really better understand what's happening and what the positions are?
Okay. So first of all, I'll just say I feel bad for Matt Lauer. I also think that Jim Lehrer should moderate every debate for every elected office in America. And if you are running for any office, city council, Congress, state legislature, dog catcher, you have to journey to Jim Lehrer and have him moderate your debate. Since he probably isn't all that thrilled with that prospect, I think all kidding aside, I read an article this morning that analyzed Lauer's performance. It was analyzed by past debate moderators, by Lehrer, by Bob Schieffer, and others. And I think what they pointed out was a really important point which has gotten overlooked in the aftermath of that program. Generally speaking, moderators don't correct candidates or call them out. They simply provide an opportunity for the other candidate to do so. And what Schieffer said, I thought was exactly right. He said if both candidates were on stage at the same time and Mr. Trump had made his claim about the war in Iraq, the proper answer is, Mrs. Clinton, your response? And the idea is it's not the moderator's job to be the traffic cop. It's the moderator's job just to keep the trains running on time and to keep the conversation flowing. I think the format created a much more difficult situation for Lauer than a more conventional format when they were both on stage together. Could he have done better? Of course he should have. But I think he was wary, as many journalists are, about appearing to take sides. And when you have another candidate on stage, all you have to do is give them an opportunity to call it out. I suspect... 10 minutes on email? I'm sorry?
10 minutes on email?
Okay. Like I said, I don't think that Lauer did a terrific job. I do think that deciding how to allocate time as it's happening is a pretty difficult thing to do. And what journalists are trained to do, to be fair to them, and I'm not taking Lauer's side or Trump's, saying what journalists are trained to do, what the best journalists are trained to do, is to ask follow-up questions. And I think what Lauer did, and my guess is if he looked back at it now, he'd realize that given a finite time format, at a certain point you just have to say okay and go on. But he was asking the kind of questions that the most reputable print journalists would ask if they had an opportunity to talk with Mrs. Clinton about that topic. I think what he lost track of is that he only had a certain amount of time available to them, and filling too much of it with that one topic was not serving the discussion well.
She should have called in to it as well.
And also a good point. I think a good candidate can, at a certain point, say, and we've certainly seen this before throughout political history, a candidate in a debate or in an interview can stand up for themselves. Again, I'm not taking sides on this, but one of the most famous moments in American debate history was in the Republican primary in 1980, when George H.W. Bush, or as we now call him George Bush Classic, was debating Ronald Reagan and the rest of the Republican field. And Reagan was unhappy with the way the debate format was being set up and the moderator was challenging him. And Reagan pointed at the moderator and said, "I paid for that microphone, Mr. Breen." And that was breaking the rules that had been agreed on, but it showed him asserting himself in a way that played to his benefit. By the same token, in 1992, at one point, Bill Clinton is on a debate stage with Jerry Brown, who is, boy, it's nice having an audience so I don't have to explain that Jerry Brown, well, never mind. And Brown had just criticized Hillary Clinton and her professional biography. And Bill Clinton violated the rules of that debate to basically say, you can say anything about me that you want, Mr. Brown, but you're not a good enough man to take on my wife. Breaking the rules, very forceful, but allowed two excellent communicators to assert themselves in a way beyond the rules, but that the voters ultimately respected. That's not a criticism of Hillary Clinton, but just saying that the opportunities are there. And what I will say, and we can talk more about this if you have more questions on it, my friend and colleague Bob Shrum says that the first presidential debate this year, a week from Monday, will be the most watched televised event since the moon landing. I have no idea if it's true or not, but it sounds great, doesn't it? I said the most watched thing since the last episode of MASH, and it didn't really have the same impact at all. But what will be very interesting is the degree to which Trump does play by the rules and the degrees to which Hillary Clinton does not.
Could you give us your perspective on the pros and cons of replacing the Electoral College with popular vote?
Oh, great question. With the Electoral College. So, if I was not in academia, if I was still running political campaigns, and you change the rules, you said, okay, no more Electoral College, there's a nationwide popular vote, I'll tell you what I would do. I would rent an apartment for my candidate in downtown Los Angeles. Actually, probably closer to LAX. I'd rent an apartment for my candidate near JFK in New York. I'd rent an apartment for my candidate at O'Hare, Houston Airport, Atlanta, and that's about it. And then my candidate would spend the entire general election campaign flying back and forth between the 5 or 6 biggest cities in the United States of America, because all I needed was the most votes. I didn't have to worry about any kind of geographic spread. I didn't have to worry about outreaching. All I needed to do was go to the place where there were the most votes. And the reason the Electoral College was originally developed was to protect the interests of the small states at the expense of the large ones. Obviously, our country's a much different place now than it was in the 18th century, but I would make that same point with just one twist. Rather than worrying about the concerns of Delaware and Rhode Island versus Massachusetts and Virginia, I want to make sure that those millions and millions of Americans, the majority of Americans who don't happen to live in one of the half a dozen biggest population centers, get a chance to see and hear from the candidates as well. So I would be reluctant to get rid of the Electoral College. What I would do if I ran the zoo, what I would do is, I think there's something to be said for maintaining the Electoral College, but doing the count winner-take-all by congressional district, the way it's done in the states of Nebraska and Maine, rather than giving all the electoral votes from one state to the person who happens to finish with 1 or 2 votes. So if you are a Democratic candidate running in Texas, you're probably not going to win, but you can come out of it with 16, 17, 18 electoral votes, because there are a lot of people in Texas who voted for you, and that ought to be reflected. And similarly, if you're a Republican living in California, you're not going to win the state, but you get a certain number of electoral votes representing those people who did vote for the GOP candidate. At that point, you get this sort of geographic spread. I can't just fly my candidate to the 6 biggest airports, but it also does provide more of a voice for the minority party in deep blue or deep red states. So I think that's probably the compromise I would go with.
Hi, my name is Esther Schifrin. Thank you very much. It's wonderful. I want to know what you think about the hacking, the recent hacking of all these emails, and also the suspicion that Russia is behind the meddling in our political situation and elections. Please tell us what you think about that.
So the question is about the hacking, and more specifically about the Russians' role in that hacking and potentially in our elections. I think it's a very significant threat. I agree with a lot of things that Barack Obama has said and done over the last 8 years. I think where he was dead wrong is when he turned to Mitt Romney in the debate in 2012, when Romney was warning about the threat of Russia, and Obama said, quote, the 1980s called, they want their foreign policy back, disparaging Romney for focusing on what Obama was articulating as not as serious a threat as some of the others that the nation faces. At that time, Obama was exactly right. That Russia was not the kind of threat as any number of others. But it's very clear to me that Vladimir Putin sees a role for Russia in this world that, in my mind, less reflects the role of Russia, the role of the Soviet Union in the middle and latter part of the 20th century, but rather pre-Soviet Russia. He believes, as do many people in the country, that their country and their people have a birthright. And that birthright gives them the ability to be one of a very small number of decision makers on the world stage. They feel like they have been deprived of that right. I think one of the reasons that Putin has succeeded to the degree that he has is he exploits the fears of his voters, of his constituents, in just the way we've been talking about, earlier. And I believe, and I want very clearly to make sure you understand I'm not taking sides here, because like I said, there are any number of things on which I admire President Obama greatly, and I think he's done tremendous things. I think Putin senses a weakness in Obama, and I think that he knows that either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton would be a much more difficult challenge. And I think what Putin is smart enough to realize is that the single best way to get Donald Trump to like you is to compliment him. And if you watch the Republican primary debate and you've watched his role on the national media stage for many years, as near as I can tell, Trump's decision point on whether someone is a good person or a bad person is whether they say nice things about Donald Trump or not. And Putin, to his credit, I think is a sufficiently astute student of psychology to know that if he gets Donald Trump to believe that he is an admirer, that's something that would work to his benefit if Mr. Trump was elected president. I don't claim to have enough knowledge to know to what degree the Russian government or anyone else is trying to affect the outcome of this election, but it is pretty clear that Putin understands and enjoys the reaction he's getting from Trump to the things that he's said about him.
My name is Pamela, and my question is, with the Libertarian Party now going to be on the ballot in all 50 states, what voting outcome do you see that having on the candidates, pro-Trump or pro-Hillary?
Hey, what's most interesting about the support that Gary Johnson, the Libertarian candidate, and Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, are getting in public opinion polls is the demographic skew. More than 1/3 of voters aged 18 to 29 are supporting either Johnson or Stein. So, but overwhelmingly, their strongest base of support comes from the youngest voters. Most polls, not all, but most polls show that Johnson and Stein draw more from Clinton than from Trump. And even our own USC Dornsife Times poll here in California, now Clinton's not going to lose California, our poll shows her 25 points ahead, but when we included Johnson and Stein in the question, she dropped twice as much as Trump did. And in a more closely contested state, in Ohio, Florida, and Nevada, the presence of those third and fourth party candidates, I suspect, are a bigger challenge for her than they are for Trump, simply because if you're a voter who's supporting a third or fourth party candidate, you've probably made up your mind pretty conclusively about Donald Trump. You do not want him to be president. But you're not that enthused, you're not that excited about Hillary Clinton either. So we'll try the third or the fourth option instead. If there isn't a third or fourth option, they probably gravitate to the candidate who they're not all that excited about versus the one who they're deeply concerned about.
My name is Judy Walkovich, and I'd like to know what you feel about the lengthening of the voting period.
I'm sorry, what do I think about?
You're getting longer and longer to vote these days. It used to be a certain day you voted, and now people can send in votes and mail in votes, and in some cases we're talking about a month ahead of time. What do you feel about
So the window for voting has grown significantly over the years that most of us have been voting. And I think the easier that you can make it for people to vote with appropriate safeguards, which is a statement guaranteed to get both the left and the right mad at me, is the right thing to do. And I think what our Secretary of State Alex Padilla is doing, and State Senator Ben Allen from not too far away from here has been instrumental on, is they've been working on a concept that they call voting centers, which has been implemented in Colorado. And so while there will not be as many polling places on election day as there have in past years, these voting centers will be open throughout the community, and you can vote at any one of them. So if you come to Skirball Center on election day for a program, instead of having to worry about getting back to your own precinct, you can vote anywhere you want to. And these voting centers will be open for days, if not weeks before the election, where any voter can drop off his or her ballot at any one of them, which to me is a really important and a seemingly obvious advancement. How many people, when they take money out of the bank, go to the bank branch where they opened their account 10 or 20 or 30 years ago? No. If I see a Bank of America card stand anywhere, I can go to it. If I can do that, and I'm not talking about online voting, why shouldn't I be able to drop off my ballot at any voting center, whether it's closer to USC, whether it's closer to Skirball, or whether it's closer to my house? So I think because you're opening up a broader window, I think that there are certain safeguards that need to be employed to make sure that this is being done in an appropriate way. But generally speaking, if people can vote a day, a week, several weeks before the election, I'm all for it. If you can make it more convenient for people, then that's a great thing, not a bad thing.
My name is Leonard Kligman. In your opinion, how close do you think America is to having another third major party?
Well, great question, Leonard. How close is America to having a third major party? Well, for 25 years, I've answered that question saying not a chance in the world. Because for all the failings, and there are many of the two major political parties, the one thing at which they are absolutely terrific is adjusting themselves to fill an unmet need in the body politic. And the example that I've offered for almost 25 years is Ross Perot, the last third-party candidate to get a significant share of the popular vote. It's worth remembering, by the way, Ross Perot finished with 19% of the vote. But early in the campaign, Perot was running ahead of both Bill Clinton and George Bush Sr., and even after he went insane on the campaign trail, he still managed to pull 19% of the popular vote, which I think is a pretty extraordinary accomplishment. Now think about how he did that. The issue on which Ross Perot ran, as many of you remember, was deficit reduction. And in that era, in the early 1990s, neither party was talking about that at all. And a lot of voters were concerned about the deficit. Perot talked about it. He developed a huge following, got almost 1 out of every 5 votes in this country. So what happened? Bill Clinton got elected president, and he made one of his top priorities deficit reduction. Newt Gingrich got elected House Speaker 2 years later. He made one of his top priorities deficit reduction. By 1996, the deficit was eliminated. Ross Perot ran for president again, and no one cared. Because the two parties had adjusted to fill that unmet need. And so I've always believed, until the last few months, that a third party would not be a viable option here. I think it is becoming a viable option again. I think as the parties move further and further and further apart from each other, I think that gaping space in the center represents an unmet need that neither party is really capable of meeting, given their respective obligations to their respective bases, the most conservative of Republicans, the most liberal of Democrats. Richard mentioned earlier, and I talked earlier about how I'd switched my party registration to no party preference. People ask me why. My Republican friends ask me, how could you leave us? My Democratic friends say, well, why don't you just come the rest of the way? And not everyone in this room is going to agree with me on every single one of these issues. But what I tell them is this. I said, it comes down to what I believe. I said, I believe in lower taxes and in marriage equality. I'm tough on crime, and I am pro-choice. I believe that citizenship is a necessary part of immigration reform, and that student test scores are an equally necessary part of teacher evaluations. I'm an independent because neither party wants me anymore. No party preference voters now represent almost 1/4 of all voters in California. Among the millennials, they now represent more than 1/3 of the electorate in that generation. And while I don't think the general concept of ideological extremism is enough to create a viable third party, I suspect that in the next not too many years, you'll see a matter of public policy, not the deficit, but something like it, emerge to crystallize that center into a third option. And I can't wait.
Thank you. My name is Burl. You talked about facilitating voting access, and you also talked about hacking. And for most people, facilitating voting access means let's do it online the way we do everything else. Where do the two coincide or diverge?
I don't think that voting online is a good idea for the reasons that we've seen over the last few months. Online communication, financial, diplomatic, is just simply not secure enough to entrust with that sort of thing. I have to admit to you, until the last few months, my biggest reason for it was knowing that my students and my kids were much better on the computer than I was, and I was terrified that Miley Cyrus was going to be the next president of the United States. But I think the more serious concern is one of security, and I think you can use technology to facilitate voting without taking the step to voting online. There's no reason in the world, as we are now just beginning to do in California, that you shouldn't be able to print your ballot online and then return it rather than having it mailed to you. There's no security measure there, but it's a cost saver and it's obviously more convenient. These voting centers rely on technology to inform people and to facilitate their voting, but ultimately the vote itself is a physical act that shouldn't be made vulnerable to the kind of hacking that we've been talking about.
Jan Moulton. I'm concerned about all the lying that's going on during this election. There was an article this week in The Economist called The Big Lie, and they were arguing that we were in actually a post-truth world where the truth didn't matter nearly as much as it used to, where feelings were elevated and became so much more important. I'm wondering, do you think that is occurring, and if so, what's the effect on the election?
So a post-truth era. I don't think I would go quite that far, but going back to the point I was making earlier, Nick Kristof's point of the me network, when you can wallow in your own ideological perfection, you're much less concerned about whether someone you agree with is using real facts or not, because you have so demonized and so marginalized the other side of the discussion. My guy or my gal, the person who I read on the blogs, who I listen to on talk radio, who I watch on cable television, well, they might stretch the truth every once in a while, but I know that they really are going to do what's best for my community, what's best for my country. So we tend to be more willing to forgive, given the fact that we've divided ourselves so dramatically. But I guess the other point I'd make, and I don't like to disagree with the economists because they're really, really smart, but on this one I think I'd offer a different perspective. I get asked a lot, is there more lying in politics today than ever before? The variant on that I get is, I'll hear, and I'm sure you have also, is there more racism or misogyny in politics today than ever before? Is there more hatred in politics than ever before? And I think the answer is no. The difference is that the haters now have, every hater has his or her own platform. Every one of us has our own platform. So go back to a pre-internet era, and someone who is motivated by the worst racial or gender or ethnic hatreds, well, odds are they're probably ostracized in their community. Now think of all the friends that they can find online and the false comfort they can find that there are so many people who agree with them. And for the rest of us, if they were sitting, in their basement spinning weird theories 25 years ago, well, I don't care. I'm never going to meet them. I'm never going to hear from them. It's just people like that in every community. But now they have Twitter accounts, and they have Facebook pages. And so I don't think that there is more hatred or more racism or more of these kind of sentiments. I think they're simply more visible, because every one of us, for both positive and very, very negative forces, has the ability to project those opinions in a way that just wasn't available to us in the past. Just don't tell the people at The Economist, okay?
Hi, my name is Merle. I'm just wondering what you think about Bernie Sanders. Why do you suppose he isn't making a greater effort to mobilize all of his enthusiastic supporters behind Hillary?
Why isn't Bernie Sanders making more of an effort to mobilize his supporters behind Clinton? Well, I would say this. I think he is making a significant effort, and he's making more of an effort than many people would have expected him to, given the type of language he was using at the very end of the primary campaign. Why is he not more full-throated, more fully committed to it? Well, I think there's a couple of things here. And this isn't unique to Sanders, and it's not unique to progressives. It's just the way people and the way politicians work. Number one, as he will tell you and told us very frequently throughout the campaign, he's not a Democrat. He caucuses with the Democrats because he finds them somewhat closer to him ideologically than the alternative, and that's why he has endorsed Hillary Clinton for president. If you noticed in his convention speech, he said, "Let me tell you why I'm endorsing Hillary Clinton." He recited his own platform and said that that's why I'm for her. So I think part of it is he has never been not only part of the party, but part of the party power structure, as it were. So I don't know that he feels the same obligation that Martin O'Malley or Joe Biden might. But the other thing, and this has got nothing to do with partisanship at all, not that the first point did either, some of it's just human nature. When a politician rises really, really quickly, you know what happens? They get vertigo. And this is not me disparaging him in the slightest in the substance of his agenda, not at all, because I've seen it happen with Republicans also. Someone who's been ignored their entire career, and ignored is harsh, and I'm exaggerating slightly, but you get my point. Someone who has been sort of an afterthought in the United States Senate, comes from a small state that doesn't get much national attention. All of a sudden, in his 8th decade, he is a celebrity. And every day there are not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands and tens of thousands of people screaming and crying because they want him to be the leader of the free world so badly. I have to tell you, if that were to happen to me, and I don't anticipate that it will, but if it did, I don't think I'd handle it all that well. And I think he's actually handled it better than I would have. But I think once you get that kind of adulation, I have to believe it takes a little while to come down from that, and the election calendar might not be giving him quite enough time to come back down.
My name is Gil. Could you comment on why Donald Trump is the most disliked candidate and Hillary Clinton is the second most disliked candidate?
Sure.
Is there any equivalence?
Is there an equivalent? The first part of the question is a lot easier than the second. Donald Trump is the least popular presidential candidate in modern American history because voters believe that he possesses neither the temperament or the experience to be president of the United States. Hillary Clinton is the second most unpopular presidential candidate in modern American history because Americans do not believe that they can trust her. Both of them have probably done more than their share to encourage those doubts. I'm not going to try to equalize them because I think different people from different perspectives can be equally outraged at either one of them. I am outraged about some of the things that Donald Trump has said about Muslims and about Mexicans and about women. That said, while I don't share the sentiments of the people she was talking about, I don't like the language that Hillary Clinton used last week to describe large portions of American voters. If you are going to be president of the United States, Democrat or Republican, you need to at least make an ongoing effort to remind people that you want to be president of all the people. And I've seen plenty of Republicans make the same mistake that she does. Mitt Romney 4 years ago, for example. I would just say the general rule is, if you're a politician, criticize your opponent, not your opponent's supporters. Because you might not think your opponent deserves the office, but if the people supporting them don't deserve your condemnation, they deserve extra effort from you to convince them before and after the election that you're going to take their concerns seriously.
My name is Stanford Noel. Many questions I could ask, but given the current electoral system in the present presidential election, what percentage of the American population, or maybe in numbers, do you think will be addressed by these candidates attempting to swing these elections? I mean, we've got maybe 3 or 5 states where you're trying to get electoral votes, and the people in the middle who are going to make the difference. How many?
Wow. Well, meaning no disrespect whatsoever, I think Secretary Clinton taught me a lesson last week that using absolute percentages is never a good way to make a broader point. I'd offer you this. Most campaigns have to achieve a balance. At the same time, they have to motivate their strongest supporters while simultaneously persuading those undecideds in the middle. And the challenge is, most of the things that you want to say, need to say and do to motivate your base are off-putting to the center. And most of the things you say to attract the center are disillusioning to the base. So the center is smaller in this election than in many, many years. Hillary Clinton is talking to younger and minority voters in her base. She knows they're not going to vote for Donald Trump, but she has to convince them that they need to vote for her. Donald Trump, and if you need any explanation for his speech in Arizona a week or so ago, Donald Trump has to motivate this group of white working class male voters, not because they're going to vote for Hillary Clinton, but they have voted in very small numbers in the last few election cycles. If they turn out in large numbers, that is historically large numbers, that is his only chance for the presidency. The remaining center are white, female, college-educated, married voters. Now, just to break this down for a second, I know we're just about out of time. I got a little bit more specific here, but more generally speaking, you can think about 4 broad demographic cohorts in the electorate. You've all read, you've all heard a lot about the gender gap. For years and years and years, women tend to be much more likely to support Democratic candidates, men tend to be much more likely to support Republicans. Less talked about, but just as impactful, is the so-called marriage gap. Married people are much more likely to vote Republican, all other things considered, and single people are much more likely to vote Democrat. So let's think about this for a second. So over here you got married men, who are the most Republican group of the 4. Way over here, you have single women, who are by far the most Democratic group. My best friend is a Republican man. He is single. He cannot date in even-numbered years because every single woman is a Democrat. Single men, and I was one until just a few years ago, we don't pay attention to politics. We watch ESPN, we read Maxim, we've got other things to do with our time. So what does that leave? Married female voters. When married female voters vote their gender, we elect Democrats. When married female voters vote their marital status, we elect Republicans. And the unique twist on that in this election is it appears that Donald Trump will be the first Republican candidate in ever to not get the majority of college-educated votes in this country. And so a white female married college-educated voter who, statistically speaking, maybe not in West LA, but across the country, is more likely to vote Republican than Democrat, has very serious reservations about Donald Trump for the reasons I mentioned just a moment ago. And to the extent that there are swing voters left in America, that's who they are.
Hi, my name is Jan Goldsmith, and since you're a political expert, if Donald Trump were to win, what do you see as the negatives, besides the Supreme Court, and are there any positives?
First of all, I appreciate the compliment that I'm not a political expert. I just talk a lot. My biggest concern about a Trump election, and I'd be happy to talk on the Clinton side as well before we leave, my biggest concern if Trump were elected president goes back to the U.S.'s role in the world that I was discussing earlier. There was an extraordinary article in the New York Times a month or two ago, many of you I'm sure saw it, in which John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, was talking about how Trump's son, Donald, Eric, I don't remember which one of the Trumpettes, I guess you'd call them, basically called to see if Kasich would be interested in the vice presidency.
Right.
And Kasich, and I hear by the murmurs that most of you read that, and you know that Kasich's response was just astonishment. He goes, I've been saying horrible things about your father all campaign long. What's this about? And young Trump said that his father felt that Kasich would be good, and Kasich basically said he wasn't interested. And Trump's son said, you would be the most powerful vice president in American history. And Kasich said, well, what do you mean by that? And Trump's son said, my father would want to put you in charge of foreign policy and domestic policy. And Kasich, this is, I don't suggest that everything just because it appears in the New York Times is true, but I didn't see a serious pushback on this from Trump or his son. So Kasich asks what I think you would agree is the logical question. Well, if the vice president is in charge of foreign policy and domestic policy, what does the president do? And the answer was, his job is to make America great again. And I had the same reaction you did, but take a step back and think about that for a second. Donald Trump has succeeded, by his own standards, in business and real estate and as a media figure, by establishing a brand. He doesn't build his buildings. He doesn't, recruit the guests for The Apprentice. He doesn't make the investment decisions. His job is about the brand. And so if Donald Trump was elected president, because I don't have much else to go on, based on what I read about his son's conversation with John Kasich, I think he would be fairly content to let more conventional, albeit very conservative, political leaders run the country. And while there are certainly things about that give me deep reservation, they're the kind of things that a government that has three equal branches of power can deal with. But I really do worry in a very, very significant way about what that means for our place on the world stage. And I worry about our ability to expand and maintain trade, economic ties, diplomatic ties, to welcome the most energetic and optimistic newcomers to the country. To me, I'd say that is my biggest concern.
This better be the last question.
Okay, I'm the last one. Oh, dear. My name is Buff Given, and speaking of Trump as a world leader, I would like to go back to your comments about Putin, and if I may disagree a bit.
Of course.
I think that it's not that Putin, in my view, does not see President Obama as a weak man, but as someone he doesn't understand. He doesn't understand a diplomat. He doesn't understand level of intelligence and the fact that the man who is the leader of, as we call it, the strongest country in the world,
We need to have a question.
that he's not more bellicose.
What I can reassure you is I think to a large degree we are in agreement. And I think Putin, simply by virtue of his political and professional biography, does not understand most American political leaders, because by definition they rose to prominence and power in a fundamentally different way than he did. So you're describing a different aspect of that misunderstanding, but I don't think you and I are in fundamentally different places at all. What I will say is that we're
kind of like it. Well, go ahead.
I was just going to thank you all once again. I think what you do here and what you're a part of is what American society lacks today. I think people coming together outside of their natural comfort zones in order to talk and listen and discuss challenges with other people who care as much as they do is something that in this 21st century online world in which we live is something that we've been losing very rapidly. It is much, much too easy once you have a smartphone to withdraw into that ideological and cultural cul-de-sac. And I have to believe, I believe as strong as I believe anything, that it is organizations like these and it's people like you that make a society and make a community work. So not only, I just want to clarify, I don't want to just thank you for having me. I want to thank you for being part of something important. And next time you come, bring more people with you, because they need it.
Thank you, Professor. Did you want the poster?
Oh, I'm okay.
Your Mona Lisa poster?
No.
By the way, she's facing the other way.